Today's lesson centers around the science of biology. In other words, what is it? We'll look at a method oftentimes referred to as the scientific method. Although there are many ways to evaluate scientific problems, this is the most common one that we'll focus on and utilize in our studies. To be clear, it's something that is studied abroad. It doesn't matter which biology class you take. We do know that most biology or almost all biology classes will have some information about the scientific method. So, one of the goals of science then is to deal with the natural world. What is it that's going on here? And if we look at some of the supernatural phenomena outside of the classroom, like maybe a haunted house or this ideas of mystic beings or ghosts, whatever you want to describe them, maybe some of the supernatural powers that you can see in the Marvel movies versus real living organisms that don't have those same characteristics. And so, one of the things that we need to be able to do is differentiate between what science is and how it can deal with some of these ideas of the supernatural. Interestingly enough, some government polls have found that 1,000 people, of 1,000 people, about 45% think that ghosts are real. In other words, if you were to visit a house or a hotel that was haunted, many of us would believe that there are reasons for that, and it's these mystic beings that somehow we can see or hear that have these special powers and that are unexplained. Even a recent survey by realtors.com suggested that 30% are kind of people would buy homes are open to living in and buying a house that was haunted, but the majority of people are not. In other words, would you buy a haunted house that was known to have some characteristics that people just couldn't explain? And so, in either way, we're looking for, as scientists, you and I, we're looking for evidence that you would need to be convinced that this house that maybe you were purchasing was haunted, or that even the ghosts were real. I'm going to skip over this. The second item there is that we as scientists do is we collect things. We collect information and we process this and we analyze it. And when we do that, we usually use graphs, and there are several different types of graphs and forms that we can use to interpret the information we collect and easily evaluate what it means. And so the example that I have here is that annual cost of several diseases in the United States and the dollar amounts that are represented in this pie chart. For example, heart disease down here has $128 billion being spent versus osteoporosis, which has about $10 billion. And so we can easily see which disease has the most money funneled into it for research. So, summarizing this, science is a body of information, knowledge that explains the natural world. And that's our idea. So, as we look at information like this, we'll use science to discover this and use the scientific method to evaluate this.
Why are
I'm going
some
to pause on that, and we showed this in class.
why are some kids sad? What makes the wind?
So, science begins with observations, just like this old book that you may have around your grandparents, your parents' house called Where's Waldo? We're looking for a particular pattern that Waldo has. So, here's Waldo on the outside here with the characteristic striped shirt, blue pants, and a hat on top here, usually carrying a cane. So, in the massive chaos that you can see maybe at this beach, Waldo is hidden somewhere in here. And again, that's the idea of observation. Some of us are really keen to some of the details necessary. Others of us just kind of, depending on the situation, will just kind of brush that aside and are unable to recognize or even remember some information or detail. By the way, there's Waldo. One of the powers of we have as humans is we can take out the details of attention. And so, and if we look at this
This is a
idea of
test of
selective
selective
attention,
attention.
one of the things that is asked to do
Count
by
how many
many
times the
psychologists is
players
to count
wearing
the number of
white pass the
passes
basketball.
that players that are wearing the a white shirt. So, just keeping track of those that are wearing that white shirt, how many passes they are doing. And
How
what we
many passes
notice is
did you
that
take?
there's a certain number of passes of those people with wearing white shirts. Now, the correct number is 15. But what people, when they're focused and have a real keen attention, is they didn't see the
And
gorilla that was walking by
the
and
correct
passing. Now,
answer
maybe you
is
did,
15 passes.
so you're able to
But did you
distinguish
see the
that. But
gorilla?
selective attention means that you're blurting out all those other elements that you're not focused on. All right. Well, one of the things that we do in science is we gather information, and this is called the data. This information, this data, in other words, are from our observations, and we're collecting that. And there are two forms of data. There's one called quantitative, and it has the word quantity in it. And the quantity means literally numbers. And so this is a measurement. This is like 4 feet or 4 meters. This is something that is measured maybe in a different type of unit like kilometers per hour. So it's something we can measure and record. The other type of data is called qualitative. And qualitative is more of a description, the quality. And this description could be a blue or red, or even this cockroach. Its color is kind of a brownish, blackish color as far as the markings, or it's large or it's small. Those are all descriptive terms that we use and are helpful in collecting information as well. So another term that I'd like to introduce here is called an inference. And an inference is based on observations or prior knowledge. For example, if I show you this photograph here, what conclusions can you draw or that you can see that you would draw right away based on your previous knowledge? Or I think one of the more obvious ones is that you're seeing the position of the vehicles very close to each other, and it looks like it's almost kissing it there between the silver and the pink car. And then we have these two, what looks like professionals, maybe going to work. And it looks like maybe perhaps one could draw on that they got into an accident. Now, that may or may not be the case, but we're drawing on our previous informations based upon the scenarios and also positions of the cars and the people that we see. So we do this all the time. We look at our and we base this information based on our experiences. So the more experiences you have, the more inferences and maybe some of the better rationale you can have as a result of this. Um, Another term that we oftentimes use and in part of the scientific method is something called the hypothesis. Oftentimes you might have had some experiences with this when people refer to this as a guess. It is a guess to some degree, but it's an educated guess. So it's proposed explanation. It's testable. Oftentimes, I would describe it as like an if-then statement. So if the Purina dog food is used, then it will reduce the dog shedding. So maybe the question was originally is dogs shed a lot, or this particular breed's sheds fur. Maybe it's based on the dog food. Another type of statement could be if Miracle Grow is used on tomato plants, then they'll be used to produce more tomatoes. Again, you create your own hypothesis and you can share it, but those are the if then statements of a hypothesis. I'm going to move on here. So, steps of the scientific method that we use. Oftentimes, we first of all make observations, we gather information, hypothesize, we test or experiment the ideas that we formed, and then we analyze this information. The analysis is referred to as our conclusions. And it may support some of our original hypotheses if we have more than one, or it may refute it. In other words, it may suggest that what we did was not what we expected, and that's okay as well. So your conclusions are just based upon the information that we gather. Um, so then it gets to this idea of what we refer to as the cause and effect. Manipulated information, in other words, this is oftentimes what we as scientists call the independent variable. These are the causes, the things that you change in an experiment. The responding pieces are referred to as the dependent variables. These are the effects, what you observe and measure. So if we look at some of the types of graphs, for example, the scatter plot, where we can start to measure some of these things, we can see some of these variables at work. If we have many variables, we would use something called a scatter plot. It shows multiple pieces of information and how it's arranged. For example, here I have weight on the bottom and height in centimeters on the x-axis. So when we have that, we can use a scatter plot to show maybe I was 160 centimeters and I weighed 40 or approximately 42. I'm sorry, 42-ish. Yeah, is was my mass. So here we're maybe taking individuals and we're showing a pattern. This line that goes down the middle would be referred to as a best fit. Another one that we use some of these variables with is the bar graph, where we show some of the commonalities, comparing data and showing averages. So, for example, we're looking at obviously the months of the year on the y-axis, and the sales, in other words, that you can see whatever that numerical value is. Maybe it's dollars, maybe it's millions of dollars, that you can see on the left hand side here. So we can see some of the sales and profits as it goes through the months in this particular case. So when we analyze data, we use what I refer to as an I2 strategy. In other words, we identify and interpret. So first of all, let's identify in this particular graph. What you'll notice, it's got a title, it's got height and fertilizer treatments. So we definitely know we're probably talking about plants. And we look down below here where we have a plant treatment, plant A, B, C, D, and E. And plant A, whatever the treatment they use, has 25%. 50% here, 100% treatment method, even more so 125%, and really kind of an excessive amount of blank, whatever that treatment method was, 150%. And what we're measuring on the x-axis then is the height in centimeters. So obviously we can draw from this is that if we add this treatment method, we would assume that plant D with 125% growth would probably be very beneficial. Maybe that's what we shoot for. But it seems like after 125%, at least in our data here, if we added too much, like 150%, the plant height actually decreases, just like on both sides here, where if you had too little or too much. So there's a reasonable amount here. That's the identification. We can interpret that, and that's what we've been doing right now is interpreting the graph, which fertilizer treatment is the best scenario for that particular plant. Um, so the other thing that we oftentimes do is we start with a topic sentence. In other words, describe what the graph is displaying here, and that's what we see right here: height and fertilizer treatments. So this scientific reasoning is often cited by we make claims about the findings, and good scientists can support these claims with evidence and reasoning. And that's the difference. If we're looking at something that's supernatural, can we test it, first of all? Or are they just claims? The house makes sounds or something along those lines. And then we have to be able to support that with evidence, and then with obviously that with the scientific reasoning beyond that. So the last little piece here then is if we look at one example of it, what do you think about the experimentation between these two? In other words, what would be the question at play here? And the way we would start it with is that if we had a particular type of water, does it make it an effect with the growth of a particular plant? Maybe this is a strawberry plant. So we're going to have an experimentation where we're going to maybe microwave water versus purified water, and does that make a difference in the growth of the plant? So we're going to manipulate something. In this case, the manipulation that we're going to do is microwave water. That's something we're changing. And then we're going to respond and record the information with the responding variable. So in conclusion, then, what we'll look at is not only some of the data that we can collect, the observations, but then there are other parts of the scientific method that we can kind of draw in here as well. And one of those is laws and theories. In other words, in science, a theory is a combination of observations and experiments to a general explanation. So some type of phenomena, like we are talking about, maybe growth of a particular strawberry plant. And then based on every information that we gather, there might be some explanations, and we could compound that with others and propose a theory, the explanations and why. So some of the theories that you might be aware of, like the theory of evolution, the germ theory, those are some common ones that you've maybe run across in earlier science classes. And the last little piece there is referred to as a law. Laws are statements that predict or tell us what to expect. The laws of thermodynamics, and they don't change. Those are something we can depend on year after year. Whereas a theory, if we get new evidence that we gather from some of the galaxies with some of our new equipment and microscopes, then some of the things that we were unaware of make shed some new light and propose some new changes to some of those theories. But laws are very concrete.